They called it a trail, but that word trail makes it sound like a walk in the park. It wasn't. It was 2,000 miles of the most punishing terrain on the American continent. And yet, between 1840 and 1869, roughly 400,000 people chose to walk it. Most of them had no idea what they were getting into. Here's the thing nobody told them at the start. The trail didn't kill you all at once. It wore you down, mile by mile, week by week, until you had nothing left to give. The whole journey took about 5 months. 5 months on foot mostly, because the wagons weren't for riding. They were for hauling supplies. You walked alongside your wagon for 20 miles a day, every single day, through wind and rain and heat and mud. And if you were lucky, you made it. But luck was not something the trail handed out freely. The story of the Oregon Trail begins not with pioneers, but with a problem. By the early 1840s, the United States was bulging at its eastern seams. Farmland in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, worn out, overcrowded, too expensive for ordinary families. And out west, 2,000 miles away, sat the Willamette Valley in present-day Oregon. Missionaries who had gone there in the 1830s sent back letters that sounded almost too good to be true. Rich black soil, mild winters, land that practically begged to be farmed. The letters spread through frontier communities like wildfire. And that was all it took. The first organized wagon train to attempt the full route left from Independence, Missouri in May of 1843. It would later be called the Great Migration. Nearly 1,000 people, almost 100 wagons, more than 5,000 cattle and oxen, lumbering along behind them. The man who helped organize it was a physician named Marcus Whitman. Whitman had made the journey before, and he believed it could be done. With discipline, with planning, with the right season, and he was right, mostly. But even Whitman couldn't prepare them for what the land itself would do to a person. The first leg out of Missouri seemed almost gentle. The prairie rolled out ahead of them green and wide, and some travelers wrote in their diaries about how beautiful it was. Then the beauty stopped, and the grinding began. The Platte River Valley in present-day Nebraska was flat, yes, but the soil turned to sand, and the sand swallowed wagon wheels. The wind never stopped. The sun was merciless. Children developed something travelers called the summer complaint, severe diarrhea from contaminated water, and some of them died within days. Cholera. That word alone was enough to make grown men lose hope. It moved invisibly through the water supply, and once it took hold, it could kill a man in hours. Thousands of graves along the trail, most of them unmarked, tell you what you need to know. One historian estimated that for every mile of the Oregon Trail, there were 17 graves. 17, for every single mile. The emigrants passed these graves constantly, and they kept walking, because stopping wasn't an option. You had to reach the mountains before the first snowfall of October, or the mountains would close on you like a trap. Time was always the enemy, so they pushed. Tired, grieving, sick, they pushed, and the trail, the road nobody had truly warned them about, had only just begun to show its teeth. What waited for them at the Rockies would test everything they thought they knew about survival. By 1843, something had shifted in the American mind. It wasn't just restlessness, it was desperation, wearing the mask of ambition. The economy back east had been broken wide open by the Panic of 1837. Banks collapsed, farms were seized, and men who had done everything right found themselves with nothing. For 6 straight years, families watched everything they built dissolve into debt. And when a man has nothing left to lose, he starts looking at a map differently. West wasn't just a direction anymore. It was the only door still open. But here's what most people don't realize. The idea of Oregon didn't come from adventurers. It came from a fur trapper named Hall Jackson Kelley, and he had never even been there. Kelley spent the 1820s writing pamphlets, breathless, almost feverish pamphlets, describing Oregon as paradise on earth. Fertile valleys, mild winters, land so rich a man could grow anything. He called it the promised land of the Western world, and people believed him. They believed him because they needed to. By the early 1840s, missionaries had followed Kelley's dream westward, men like Marcus Whitman. Whitman made the trip to Oregon in 1836 and sent back one critical message. The wagons could make it. That single piece of information changed everything. Because before Whitman, people assumed wagons couldn't cross the Rockies. They assumed you'd have to leave your life behind, your furniture, your plows, your seed. But if wagons could make it, you could bring your life with you. You could actually start over, not just survive. Then came John C. Frémont. In 1842, the US government sent him to map the route, the actual detailed mile-by-mile route. Frémont came back with something nobody had ever produced, a guidebook that real families could follow. It told you where the water was, where the grass was, how many miles between rest points. It turned a vague dream into a set of instructions. And then, and this is where it gets almost unbelievable, 12 years after Kelley's pamphlets, it actually started. May 22, 1843, near Independence, Missouri, nearly 1,000 people gathered at the edge of known America. They called it the Great Migration. 1,000 people, 120 wagons, 5,000 head of cattle. These weren't soldiers or explorers. They were farmers, teachers, mothers, children. A school teacher named Peter Burnett helped organize the group. He was not a frontiersman. He was a man deep in debt trying to outrun his creditors. And that, more than anything, tells you who these people really were. They were ordinary Americans who had run out of ordinary options. The trail stretched over 2,000 miles, across the Great Plains, through the South Pass of the Rockies, down into the Columbia River Basin. They would walk most of it. The wagons weren't for riding, they were for carrying food and supplies. Every mile was walked on foot, in boots that wore through, across ground that showed no mercy, and they absolutely knew, that some of them would not make it. Disease moved through wagon trains like a rumor, fast and quiet. Cholera could kill a man between sunrise and sundown. Accidents happened. River crossings went wrong, wagons overturned, children wandered and were lost. But still they came, year after year after year, because the alternative, staying where they were, felt like slow suffocation. Here's the thing about the Oregon Trail that people forget. It wasn't a trail when they started, it was just west. The trail was made by the people walking it. Every rut cut deeper into the earth by the wagon that came before. By the time the last wagon trains rolled in the 1860s, those ruts were 4 feet deep in places. You can still see them today, and if you know where to look, you can stand in those grooves and feel the weight of it. 1,000 people walking into the unknown, building the road as they went. But what they were about to face on that road, no pamphlet had prepared them for it. Before any American family packed a single wagon, someone had to walk the land first. And that someone was Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. In 1804, President Thomas Jefferson sent them west with a simple order: find a path to the Pacific. They didn't have a map. They were making the map. For 2 years and 4 months, Lewis and Clark pushed through country no American had ever documented. They crossed the Missouri River, the Rockies, and finally reached the Oregon coast in November 1805. Clark etched his name into a tree at the shoreline. William Clark, by land from the U.S. states in 1804 and 1805. That tree is gone now, but those words started everything. Their journals came back filled with something extraordinary, not just maps, but descriptions. Descriptions of rivers that moved fast and clean, of valleys so green they looked painted, of mountains that blocked the sky. People read those words and felt something pull at them. But Lewis and Clark traveled in a military expedition. 33 people, armed, organized, funded by the government. The real trail, the trail ordinary families would one day walk, wasn't carved by soldiers. It was carved by one man who did it almost entirely alone. His name was John C. Frémont, and in 1842 he was 29 years old. He was a lieutenant in the Army Topographical Corps, which sounds impressive. What it actually meant was, go find out what's out there and draw it accurately. Frémont took a small crew west that summer. With him was a man named Kit Carson, a frontier scout who had been living in the wilderness since he was 16. Carson didn't read or write, but he knew every canyon, every water source, every hostile stretch of land between Missouri and the Rockies. He moved through the wilderness the way other men moved through their own living rooms. Together, Frémont and Carson pushed into the Wind River Range of Wyoming in late summer. Frémont climbed what he believed was the highest peak in the Rockies. He was wrong about that. It wasn't the highest, but he was right about something more important. He was right that a wagon could get through. His 1843 report, published by Congress and distributed across the eastern states, was the first document that told ordinary Americans exactly how to do it. Not just that the West existed, but how many miles between water sources, how steep the passes were, where the grass grew for the animals, which rivers could be forded and which would swallow a wagon whole. People called it the Pathfinder's Report. Thousands of families read it at their kitchen tables in Ohio, in Missouri, in Kentucky. Some of them read it and thought, maybe not. Some of them read it and started selling everything they owned. But Frémont didn't invent the path from nothing. There was a fur trapper named Jedediah Smith. In 1824, Smith found the South Pass, a wide, gradual break in the Rocky Mountains in what is now Wyoming. It was the discovery that made the whole trail possible. Without South Pass, wagons couldn't cross the Rockies. With it, they could. Smith found that pass while tracking beaver in knee-deep snow, half-starved, with a party of 7 men. He didn't announce it. He just kept moving. That was the nature of these men. They weren't building a trail for other people. They were just living their lives on the edge of the known world. And in doing so, they accidentally drew America a road. By the time the first true wagon train rolled out of Independence, Missouri, in 1841, the bones of the route already existed. Someone had walked every mile of it. Not on purpose, just because they had to. But the men who mapped the trail had no idea what they had actually started. They left in May, missed the window, and the mountain passes would be buried in snow before you ever reached them. So every family that lined up at Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1843 knew exactly what they were betting. Everything. The wagon itself was about the size of a modern moving truck bed, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide. Inside it, a family crammed 6 months of food, farming tools, medicine, blankets, seed, and whatever pieces of their old life they couldn't let go of. A cast iron stove, a rocking chair, a daguerreotype of a grandmother they would never see again. The oxen pulling it weighed over 1,000 pounds each. You needed at least 4 of them, and even with 4, on a bad day, they moved 15 miles. On a good day, maybe 20. 2,000 miles total. Do the math yourself. The trail had a shape to it, not just a line on a map, but a rhythm that every emigrant felt in their bones. First came the Prairie, Kansas, Nebraska, flat, wide, and almost peaceful if you didn't know what was coming. The grass was chest high in early summer, and the wildflowers were so thick they colored the horizon purple and gold. Families let their children run alongside the wagons here. It was the last easy stretch they would ever have. By late June, the land started to push back. The wagons hit the Platte River Road, and the ground turned sandy and loose. Wheels sank, oxen strained, and the insects came. Clouds of gnats so thick, emigrants tied cloth over their faces to breathe. Still, there was one landmark that kept everyone going in those early weeks: Chimney Rock, a single spire of pale clay and volcanic ash rising 300 feet out of the Nebraska flatlands. Every emigrant who kept a journal mentioned it. Jesse Applegate, who crossed with the Great Migration of 1843, called it a Tower of Babel. It was the first real proof you were actually getting somewhere. Then the trail climbed. South Pass, Wyoming, the gateway through the Rockies, sat at over 7,000 feet. In July, it could still snow up there. The pass itself was wide enough that crossing it didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt like a gentle slope. But when you stood at the top and looked west, something shifted. You were no longer in the United States. Not legally, not yet. The land beyond that pass belonged to nobody, or to everybody, depending on who you asked. Britain and America were still arguing over it. The emigrants weren't waiting for politicians to sort it out, just walked into it. Fort Hall, in present-day Idaho, was the last real outpost of anything familiar. By the time wagons pulled in there, the journey had been going for 3 months. Oxen were starting to give out. Emigrants were trading their heavy furniture for food and fresh animals. Rocking chairs, desks, iron cook stoves, left in the dirt beside the trail. If you know where to look in Idaho and eastern Oregon, you can still find the ruts. 2 feet deep in some places, cut by thousands of iron wheels into rock that doesn't forget. The hardest stretch came last, as it always does. The Blue Mountains of Oregon, then the Columbia River Gorge, steep, treacherous, and beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Some families tried to float their wagons down the river on rafts. Some of those families drowned. By the time the Willamette Valley finally appeared through the trees, green, broad, and impossibly fertile, emigrants had been walking for 5 months. Most of them had worn through at least 2 pairs of boots. Some had buried a child on the trail. All of them had left behind a version of themselves they would never get back. But what they found waiting in that valley, and who was already there, would force a reckoning nobody had prepared for. They had been walking for weeks, and their bodies were starting to fail them. The sun baked the ground until it cracked, and the dust never stopped. It got into their lungs, their food, their water, their eyes. A man named Asa Lovejoy wrote in his journal that his lips bled every single morning from the dryness. That was just week 3. The average emigrant walked 15 miles a day. Not rode, walked. Oxen were too valuable to burden, so the people walked alongside them. 15 miles sounds manageable until you do it in 100-degree heat, in boots that were never made for this. Blisters turned into open sores. Open sores turned into infections, and there was no doctor for the next 300 miles. One of the cruelest killers on the trail was something almost invisible: cholera. It could take a perfectly healthy man, put him in the ground, and be done with him in 24 hours. The emigrants didn't understand it. They thought it came from bad air, from night fog, from God's punishment. They didn't know it came from contaminated water, from the same rivers they were drinking out of every single day. In 1852, the deadliest year on the trail, an estimated 10,000 people died. That's not a typo. 10,000 people. Some stretches of the trail had graves every 80 feet. Travelers stopped counting. A young woman named Lydia Allen Rudd kept a diary during her 1852 crossing. She recorded grave after grave after grave, day after day, for weeks. At one point she wrote simply, "Passed many graves today. No names, no prayers recorded. Just past them." Because there was no time. You had to keep moving. If a wheel broke, you fixed it that night. If an ox died, you left it. If a person died, you buried them as fast as you could and you kept walking. The grief didn't go away. It just got packed somewhere deep, somewhere you couldn't look at yet. And it wasn't just the body breaking down. The mind started to go too. Weeks into the crossing, emigrants began reporting something strange. Hallucinations. Men saw lakes that weren't there, mirages shimmering on the horizon, cool and blue and absolutely real looking. Women reported hearing their children's voices from outside the wagon at night, when the children were asleep inside. One emigrant described seeing a city rising out of the plains, buildings, steeples, smoke. It was nothing, just heat and exhaustion, and a brain running on empty. The monotony was its own kind of torture. Same sky, same dirt, same creak of the wheels. Day after day after day, the landscape barely changed for hundreds of miles. Emigrants wrote about losing all sense of time, of not knowing what day it was, what week it was. One man in an 1845 party confessed in his journal that he had begun to talk to his oxen, full conversations. He said they were better listeners than most men he knew. Children on the trail grew up fast, and not in the way anyone wanted. They saw death before they could read. They helped dig graves for siblings, for parents, for strangers. A girl named Jessie Applegate, who crossed in 1843 at age 7, later wrote that she did not cry when she saw the dead. Not because she didn't feel it, because by then she had already seen so much that the feeling had moved somewhere else inside her. That is what the trail did. It didn't just test you. It remade you whether you wanted it to or not. And for those who survived this far, something even worse was waiting just ahead. The ground didn't warn you. It just opened up and swallowed someone whole. A wagon wheel snapping, a child slipping under, a river that looked shallow but wasn't. The trail killed roughly 1 in 10. Some estimates say 1 grave for every 80 yards between Missouri and Oregon. The length of a city block. That's how often someone died on the Oregon Trail. And most of them didn't die the way you'd imagine. You picture attacks, you picture mountain storms, you picture starvation, but the #1 killer on the trail was something invisible: cholera. It came from contaminated water, one bad drink, and within hours, you were gone. A man named Alonzo Delano described watching a fellow traveler sit down to rest at noon and be dead by sundown. Perfectly healthy in the morning, dead before the sun set. Cholera moved through wagon trains like fire through dry grass. One person got sick, then three, then the whole camp was in crisis. Families had to make a choice no one should ever have to make: stay and risk everyone, or keep moving and leave the dying behind. They kept moving, because stopping meant dying too. The graves were usually shallow. There wasn't time or energy for anything deeper. They marked them with wooden boards when they could, carved initials with a knife, piled rocks on top to keep the wolves away. Sometimes it didn't work. Travelers coming days behind found the graves already disturbed. Some emigrants stopped writing in their diaries after a while, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was. A woman named Amelia Knight kept one of the most detailed records of the 1853 crossing. She was pregnant the entire journey. She gave birth to her 8th child, somewhere in present-day Oregon, in a wagon, in the rain, with no doctor within 100 miles. The baby survived. Not everyone's did. Children died more than anyone. They fell off wagons and the wheels went over them before anyone could stop. They drank water from puddles when no one was watching. They got fevers that had no names, no cures, and no mercy. In the diaries you see the same phrase over and over: buried our little one today and moved on. Moved on, because what else could you do? The river crossings took lives nobody expected. The Green River, the Snake River, the Platte, each one had a reputation, and each one earned it. A crossing that looked calm could turn violent in minutes if upstream rains hit. Wagons were ferried across when families could pay. When they couldn't, they caulked the wagon bed, floated it, and prayed. Sometimes it worked. In 1852, near the Snake River, a whole family, parents, 4 children, the oxen, everything, went under in under a minute. Witnesses on the bank couldn't do anything but watch. Then they rode it down and kept moving. There were the accidents no one talks about. A man named Joel Hembry became one of the first recorded deaths on the trail. In 1843, he was 6 years old. He fell off a wagon and was crushed. His grave was found again in 1961 by a road crew in Wyoming. The marker still there, still legible. Over 100 years later, the ground had held him. What the trail took, it rarely gave back. But here's the thing that doesn't show up in the numbers. Some of them knew they weren't going to make it before they even left home. Some of them got sick at the start, were told to turn back, and refused. They chose the trail anyway, knowing what it might cost them. That choice, that stubborn, terrifying, human choice, is what makes what happened next so hard to believe. They had survived the prairie. They had survived the heat, the cholera, the graves they dug and tried not to count. But now, somewhere past Fort Laramie, the land itself changed its mind. The flat world ended, and the Rockies rose up like a wall God built to keep people out. This was the moment every emigrant had heard about back in Missouri, in Ohio, in Illinois, the moment the trail stopped being hard and started being impossible. At South Pass, the trail crept up to nearly 7,500 feet above sea level. Your lungs worked twice as hard for half the air. Oxen that had pulled 1,000 pounds across Kansas now stumbled on loose shale like they were learning to walk for the first time. People woke up with splitting headaches and thought they were getting sick. Some of them were, but most were just meeting the mountains for the first time, and the mountains didn't care about the introduction. Here's what nobody tells you about South Pass. It doesn't look like a mountain pass. There's no dramatic cliff, no terrifying drop. It's almost gentle. A broad, treeless valley that slopes so gradually you can barely feel the climb. That was the mercy the trail gave you. The Rockies let you through at the one spot where they were exhausted too. And on the other side of that pass, something strange happened to the rivers. They stopped running east. Every river back on the plains had drained toward the Missouri, toward the Mississippi, toward the Atlantic. But here, west of the divide, the water went the other way, toward the Pacific, toward the coast, toward Oregon. For emigrants who had never left the eastern half of the continent, that was the moment it felt real. They were on the other side of America now, but the relief lasted maybe a day, because the rivers didn't just drain west, they had to be crossed. And in the summer of 1843, the year the Great Migration started, More than 800 people pushing wagons toward Oregon. The crossings were the part that killed the most. Not the mountains, not disease, the water, the Snake River. That was the name people said quietly, the way you talk about something you're afraid of. By the time the trail reached southern Idaho, it followed the Snake for nearly 300 miles, and crossing it wasn't optional. The river ran fast, deep and cold, fed by snowmelt from mountains that had no interest in letting go. At the three-island crossing near present-day Glens Ferry, Idaho, the trail offered emigrants a choice. You could try to ford the river at 3 rocky islands that broke the current into manageable channels, or you could stay on the south bank, the harder, drier, more brutal route, and avoid the water entirely. Most people chose the crossing. Most people almost drowned doing it. The wagons had to be sealed with tar to keep the water out. Oxen were unhitched and forced to swim. Children were tucked into the high corners of wagon beds with their legs pulled up, watching water pour in through the cracks their fathers swore they'd sealed. The current didn't wait for anyone to be ready. In the summer of 1852 alone, one of the heaviest migration years, at least a dozen people drowned at crossings along the Snake. A woman named Elizabeth Wood described the crossing in her diary as the most terrifying 2 minutes of my entire life. 2 minutes. That's how fast it could go from dry ground to catastrophe. And the Snake wasn't even the last crossing. Past Idaho, the trail climbed again, through the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, cold and forested and deeply silent. Trees so tall they blocked the sky, mud thick enough to swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. By the time families reached the Cascade Range, the final mountain wall between them and the Willamette Valley, they had been walking for 4 months. Their shoes had worn through, their oxen were gaunt, their flour was almost gone, and standing at the Cascades, staring down at a river that offered no mercy, some of them made a choice that would cost everything. The choice between the mountain and the water, and what it meant to pick wrong. That's the story coming next. They called it the Promised Land. But when the first wagons finally rolled into the Willamette Valley in the fall of 1843, the reality was complicated. The valley was green, yes, impossibly green after 2,000 miles of dust and sage. But it was also wild, wet, and completely unorganized. There was no town waiting for them, no government, no land office, no one handing out deeds. Just trees, rain, and the slow realization that the hard part wasn't over. The men who had sold them on this dream, and there were men who sold it, deliberately, had stretched the truth until it nearly snapped. Paul Jackson Kelley was one of them, a Boston schoolteacher who had never actually lived in Oregon. Kelley spent the 1830s writing pamphlets describing a paradise of fertile soil and perfect climate. He called Oregon the most valuable of all the unoccupied parts of the earth. He had never farmed a day in his life. Nathaniel Wyeth tried to turn Oregon into a business empire and lost everything. John Frémont's government reports, widely published and widely read, made the trail sound like a manageable adventure. It was not a manageable adventure. And now the survivors, the ones who made it, stood at the edge of the valley and had to start completely from scratch. The Donation Land Claim Act wouldn't arrive until 1850. For the settlers who came before it, land ownership was a gentleman's agreement at best. You found a patch of ground, you cleared it, you planted stakes, and you hoped your neighbor agreed those stakes meant something. Disputes were settled by whoever had more men or more nerve. The journey had cost them everything: oxen, wagons, furniture, sometimes children. And this was the reward. The first winter hit hard. The Willamette Valley receives over 40 inches of rain a year. Setters from Missouri and Illinois had never seen rain like that. Log cabins went up fast and came down almost as fast, poorly built by exhausted people who had forgotten what it felt like to stop moving. Disease moved through the new settlements almost immediately. Malaria, called the ague by settlers, had already been decimating the indigenous Kalapuya people of the valley for over a decade. By the time American settlers arrived in large numbers, the Kalapuya population had collapsed from an estimated 3,000 to fewer than 600. The land the settlers called empty had been made empty by disease that arrived on trading ships years before any wagon ever crossed the Rockies. That history was invisible to the settlers. They saw open land and called it Providence. Some did find what they were looking for: Jesse Applegate, who had led a wagon company in 1843 and watched two of his nephews drown crossing the Columbia River, eventually built a prosperous farm in the valley. He wrote about the journey later, honestly, without glamour. He knew what it had cost. But for every Applegate, there were dozens of families who lasted one winter and gave up. Some drifted back east, some died, some just kept moving, south into California, north toward the Puget Sound, searching for the version of the promise that matched what they'd been told. By 1845, the trail was carrying over 3,000 emigrants a year. By 1848, the number would spike so dramatically that the trail itself would transform into something almost unrecognizable. Because that year, something was discovered about 200 miles south of the Willamette Valley. Something small, sitting in the cold water of a sawmill ditch. Something that would reroute the dreams of an entire generation, almost overnight. The Oregon Trail would never be just about Oregon again. The land didn't stay empty for long, and that's the thing nobody talks about, because when the settlers arrived, they didn't find wilderness. They found people already living there, thousands of them. The Cayuse, the Nez Perce, the Chinook, nations with languages, laws, trade routes, and histories stretching back 10,000 years. And the wagon trains rolled straight through the middle of it all. At first, the relationship wasn't war. The Nez Perce had actually helped Lewis and Clark survive their expedition in 1805. They had fed them, guided them, saved their lives, really. And for a while, that goodwill carried forward. Some tribes traded with the early pioneers, offered food, horses, safe passage across rivers. But here's the thing about a trickle becoming a flood. In 1843, nearly 1,000 people crossed the trail. By 1845, it was 3,000. By 1850, the number had exploded into the tens of thousands. And with every wagon that rolled through, something was taken. The buffalo herds were thinned, the grass that the native horses grazed on, gone, eaten by settler livestock. The game animals, hunted by people passing through who had no intention of managing what they took. The Platte River Valley, which had fed and sustained tribes for generations, began to look like a highway, because it was. And then disease came with the travelers. Cholera, measles, smallpox, diseases that the settlers carried without even knowing it. Among the Cayuse people, the dying was catastrophic. In 1847, a measles outbreak swept through their territory near present-day Walla Walla, Washington. A missionary named Marcus Whitman was operating a mission there. He was treating both settlers and Cayuse, but the settlers recovered. The Cayuse didn't. Half of the Cayuse nation died in that outbreak. Half. To the Cayuse, the pattern was clear. The white medicine man was healing his own people and poisoning theirs. On November 29, 1847, a group of Cayuse men killed Marcus Whitman, his wife Narcissa, and 11 others at the mission. It became known as the Whitman Massacre. The United States government used it to justify a military campaign against the Cayuse. Congress suddenly moved fast. Oregon was officially organized as a U.S. territory in 1848, just weeks after news of the massacre reached Washington. Timing is everything in politics. What followed was a decades-long pattern. Treaties signed, then broken. Reservations drawn, then shrunk. Tribes relocated off land their ancestors had named. The Nez Perce, the same nation that had saved Lewis and Clark, were eventually forced onto a reservation in 1863. Their leader, Chief Joseph, would spend the rest of his life fighting for the right to go home. He never made it back. The land that the trail brochures called empty and wild and free for the taking, it was never empty. It was full of people who had no say in what was coming. And by the time the Great Migration ended, those people had lost nearly everything. Their territory, their food sources, their numbers, all of it traded away, not by them but for them, in exchange for a version of America that didn't include them at all. But even as the settlers built their farms and their towns, and their new lives on land that wasn't theirs to claim, something darker was already waiting for them too. By 1869, the last major wagon train had crossed the Blue Mountains. The era that had consumed nearly 3 decades of American ambition was quietly closing. No single event marked the end, just a slow fading, like smoke after a fire dies. But the trail left behind something no one had planned for. First, there were the graves. Historians estimate that between 1840 and 1870, roughly 1 in 10 immigrants died on the journey. That is approximately 65,000 people buried along 2,000 miles of open country. Some graves had wooden markers. Most had nothing at all. A child named Joel Hembry became one of the first documented deaths on the trail. He fell from a wagon wheel in 1843, just 7 years old. His grave near present-day Glen Rock, Wyoming, was found and verified in 1961. It is still there today. And Joel was just one. 65,000 more names are scattered across the plains, largely forgotten. But the trail left other marks too, ones you can still see from the air. Near Guernsey, Wyoming, the wagon wheels cut so deep into the soft rock that the grooves are 4 feet down. Millions of wheels, millions of footsteps. The stone remembered every single one. At Register Cliff, just a few miles away, emigrants carved their names into the soft limestone. You can still read them. James C. Worthington, 1850. Sarah Keyes would not make it that far on her journey. She died near present-day Alcove Spring, Kansas, in May 1846, one of the first casualties of the Donner Party, before the horror even began. Her grave is now a quiet, grassy place that most people drive past without knowing. The trail reshaped the West in ways that went far beyond the graves and the ruts. Entire ecosystems were stripped bare along the route. Emigrants cut every tree they could find for firewood. Buffalo grass that had taken centuries to grow was trampled into mud, then dust. The Platte River corridor, once thick with cottonwood groves, was nearly cleared by the 1860s. The Lakota and Pawnee who depended on those trees and that grass watched their world get eaten mile by mile. By 1870, the bison herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were already fracturing. The trail had cut them in half, literally splitting migration patterns that had existed for 10,000 years. Within 2 decades, the great herds would be nearly gone. The Oregon Trail also left behind something harder to measure, an idea. The idea that if you were brave enough or desperate enough, you could simply go. You could leave everything broken in your life and walk toward something better. Thousands did exactly that. Families fleeing debt, failure, disease, grief. They loaded everything into a wagon and pointed it west. Some found what they were looking for. Many did not. But the act of going, that became part of the American identity in a way that is almost impossible to untangle now. The Oregon Trail was never really about Oregon. It was about what Americans believed they were: restless, forward-moving, unwilling to accept the life they were handed. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman had believed that. The Donner Party had believed that. Jesse Applegate had believed that, enough to ride back into the wilderness to find a better way. Even the immigrants who turned back, and many did, believed it, at least for a season. The last wagon to cross the Blue Mountains did so quietly, without ceremony. No one recorded who was in it, no one thought to. By then, the Transcontinental Railroad had already stolen the drama. The Golden Spike had been driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869. A journey that took 6 months now took 6 days. The trail did not die loudly, it just became unnecessary. But the ruts are still there, the names are still carved in the cliff, and 65,000 people are still buried beneath the ground you might be driving over right now, on some unremarkable stretch of highway between nowhere and somewhere.